Did you ever think the Bible of all books, with its supposedly perfect moral code, would be so quick to give up a woman's autonomy? Well, we're going to look at a very problematic Bible passage, Deuteronomy 22:28 to 29. I know I'm not the first person to heavily analyze this passage. I'm going to read it, give my thoughts and commentary, and then we'll look at common apologetics trying to dismiss what's going on in the passage. I'm going to read from the Common English Bible since that's what I'm used to and own for myself, but I'll get into other translations later on. If a man meets up with a young woman who is a virgin and not engaged, grabs her and has sex with her, and they are caught in the act, the man who had sex with her must give 50 silver shekels to the young woman's father. She will also become his wife because he has humiliated her. He is never allowed to divorce her. Let's unpack this. First, this is a very specific scenario. However, it's important to have regulations for this because this deals with grape. Or does it? We'll get into that later, but let's focus on what the text says here. Instead of the man being put in a jail or sentenced to community service or something, he must pay not the victim, but the victim's father, then marry the woman forever. And the way this is worded sounds like it's the man's punishment. I would argue it's more of a punishment for the woman, and I'll tell you why. If a man violates a woman without permission, she's going to be traumatized. You can't blame her for that. But this punishment means she must be married to the man who did this horrible thing to her. And if someone did that to me, I wouldn't want to be near the man. Nowadays, a reasonable thing to do is file a restraining order on top of the punishment of doing the thing itself. The Bible is commanding the people to do the exact opposite. And I feel like I'm in a romance book with all this forced proximity. Now let's look at the historical context behind this verse. At the time, a woman's virginity was very important. It was arguably more important than the woman herself. And for some reason, the same scrutiny was not applied to men. I don't think it's a coincidence that God is commanding the very practices already used in society at the time. This all goes back to my personal theory that the Bible, or at least this section, was written by maybe some government officials as a way to maintain control. It's been enforced that way, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was written that way, because more people will follow the rules if they have reason to believe God commanded them. This claim isn't very strong at the moment, as I'll have to research the assembling of the Bible as well as read more than just the first six books. My point is, the odds that the people were already dealing with virginity the exact same way this God prefers before he even gave his commands have got to be slim. Not to mention the fact that God is equally as sexist as the society at the time if he wants this woman to be married to the man who did this unspeakable act to her. And plus, apparently the woman isn't even capable of handling money according to her, given to her according to this text. That's at least how I interpreted it with my potential confirmation bias and all. Oh yeah, interpretations. We've got to get into those. But the differences in interpretations often stemmed from differences while translating the passage from Hebrew. When I read from the CEB, the text was clear that we were dealing with something without consent. The Christian Standard Bible, or CSB, seems to be the most obvious. With other translations, this isn't always the case. A good example would be the English Standard Version. I'll admit the CSB is 15 years younger than the ESV. However, the two versions aren't that different if you analyze them. The way I could tell the ESV refers to acts without consent is the word seizes, the same word that shares the same meaning as brutally attacking or capturing. Yeah, there's no way consent was involved. Okay, so let's look at an older one, the 1599 Geneva Bible. The key in this version is harder to spot, and I'd say the phrase takes her. This can't mean metaphorical taking, as in taking her hand in marriage, for example, since sex is a physical action. So even in 1599, this wasn't referring to consensual sex. Another popular version, the King James Version, uses the phrase lay hold on her. And look at that, the word siege is literally a synonym. So we have a book from 1599 agreeing with this claim, as well as a version written from 1610 to 1611. And I don't think this is confirmation bias because all it took for me to come to this conclusion was just double checking a few definitions. I was also told the Hebrew word tafas, I think I pronounced that right, means to seize or grab hold of, which I'm assuming would be forcefully because what else would it be? Now, I don't know Hebrew, so I could use some confirmation about whether that's correct, but I think you get the point. Okay, so we've gone over what different versions of the Bible have to say. I'm assuming you all have come to the same conclusion as I have, and if you have not, and your reasoning is not any of the apologetics I'm about to cover, I invite you to tell me why in the comments. Another thing I did for research was look at apologetic videos online, and I found something worth sharing. It's on a channel called Ask the Pastor, where Pastor Joshua Sullivan answered a concerned Christian who desperately wants the answers to how God could allow this. And to be honest, I can't blame them. I mean, who better to go with biblical questions than your pastor? But let's get into the video's responses, as well as some others. You're looking at it with modern eyes. If it were ever okay to force a woman to be with the man who violated her, I am concerned. It was never right, in my opinion, for anyone to hold this belief. I understand many were taught this as a result of their parents, and so on. But this generational cycle could easily be broken if questioning the Bible wasn't so frowned upon. To those who still hold this belief, when was it ever okay for a society to implement a law like this? When apologists use this argument, they don't seem worried by the values of this culture at the time. In the video I mentioned, the pastor describes the outcome as both punishing the man and protecting the woman, but that analysis seems to ignore the mental damage caused by the act itself. And remember, society didn't value mental health at the time, so they probably didn't care. I think the easiest thing to do is ignore your theological rules and look at what you think the text means as opposed to the theology trying to cover this up. An all-powerful God bounding by himself by the norms of the Israelite society at the time is stripping him of his power. If you're a Christian watching this, I'm sure you're a good person. You may not believe this punishment is good. If you do, just ponder this for a second while I move on because we already went into the historical context. This punishment is just because unity in flesh must happen through marriage. Why is sex before marriage such a bad thing in God's eyes? I don't like sex before marriage because I find it disgusting. Then again, I find all sex disgusting, but I don't think it should be illegal or a sin, unless it's without consent, as I proved this is the case earlier in the video. I'm aware ancient Israelites didn't want to marry a woman who wasn't a virgin, but if their religion didn't shame them so much for that, their society would have been in a better spot. Plus, if we're talking about financial reasons, first, give women a right to hold the same funds as men. You don't even have to grant this point if you just let her marry whoever she wants. No law accounts for a person's happiness. You realize how terrible this law is if you listen to an interview of a victim of this horrendous act. Found an article from Loyola University about common reactions and feelings when this thing happens. You'll not believe how many apologists invalidate these victims when they speak these words. Not to mention the statistic that this article gives that two-thirds of abusers deny any wrongdoing, showing signs of emotional manipulation. The pastor literally says God won't allow a man to destroy a woman's life because of the man's actions. Yes, he will, because what the heck do you think forced proximity with your abuser does to the victim, other than totally traumatize them? Exodus 22 already says you technically don't have to marry him if you don't want to. Yet that law also violates a woman's autonomy because this is only the case if the father says no, not if she says no. Plus, that's with consensual sex. There'd be no point in making this distinction if the latter verse addressed the same topic. Besides, what about she will become his wife and he is never allowed to divorce her makes it sound consensual. Also, I feel like now is the best time to bring up the fact that he referred to in the video atheists who opposed his view as feminists with a clear negative connotation that makes it sound like he's in favor of the patriarchy. So as a result, I will no longer be giving this pastor the benefit of the doubt. You're just cherry picking. This is simply an exhibit of evidence as to why the Christian God is immoral. I want to make something clear. He's not commanding this horrible act. He's got a punishment for it. The punishment in question is problematic, and I already went into it. The Old Testament still doesn't apply to us. Biblically, yes, it does. Matthew 5:18 says, "As long as heaven and earth exist, neither the smallest letter nor even the smallest stroke of a pen will be erased from the law until everything there becomes of reality." Heaven and earth clearly still exist, meaning the law must still be followed. Deuteronomy 22:25 to 27 makes a distinction. Indeed, it does, but not the one of consent that you think of. It instead makes a distinction between who is around. The latter verses apply if they are caught by someone. The former verses assume the woman has called out for help, but no one was around. In verse 24, we can see that a woman is punished for not crying out during adultery through death. The law doesn't seem to specify if this punishment also applies to the woman during unconsensual sex, since verse 27 assumes the woman called for help. And if this form of adultery happened to be forceful, why should the woman be punished? Isn't one of the responses to trauma silence? Actually, it is because of what is in the link I mentioned above. It doesn't help when the man is more often than not going to deny that he did anything bad. I knew I couldn't finish out this video without seeing what Microsoft Copilot thought of this issue. I asked what its stance on it was and whether it thought the punishment was just and fair. Why am I talking to it like it's a person? Anyway, I'm not good with AI. I rarely use it. Anyway, it used the culture and time excuse. Again, why is God's holy command bound by cultural restrictions? God said to follow this law forever. Jesus said to follow the law until heaven and earth pass away. We can't make progress as a society if we're bound by ancient cultural practices, and God knows that if He's all knowing.